I want to share with you a couple of things that I think make enterprise, that will help you be successful in enterprise software product management. Enterprise software is a little bit different from consumer software. Many of the things are the same, but a few of the things are different. And my goal in this talk is to pick up on some of those differences and give you some metaphors that you can use when you think about these problems. Obviously, in 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, I won't solve the world, but hopefully these stories will give you something that you can use in your daily life. The book on the right, I did do computer science at high school, and I hated it. We were the first year that did it in the late 80s, and I was clearing up a few weeks ago in my house, and I found a copy of the DOS guide that's from an Apple II, and that was my first computing book. But I'm going to talk to you about enterprise buying behavior, challenges of feature versus function, why I think niches are cool, and I'm going to finish off by talking about my favorite topic, which is integration. And these are things I think that differentiate consumer software and enterprise software. And I think these lessons initially, I think I was aiming to apply this at, for people who are building a startup or building a scale up, but I think they apply also if you work within enterprises. But take the advice as it comes. So the first metaphor I would like to share with you is in trying to understand enterprise buying behavior. The first fundamental difference about enterprise software is compared to consumer software is usually with consumer software, the person who is buying the product is the one that is using it. In enterprise software, usually the person using the product, right, has nothing to do with the person that's buying it. So for instance, in financial systems, the accounts receivable administrator is not involved in the purchase decision of that software. It's the CFO. And the accounts receivable consumer is the user is the one that's using it every single day. The CFO hardly touches the system, but they're the one who makes the purchase decision, right? So when you build enterprise software, you've got this tension between the users of the software and the ultimate beneficiary of the software, which is the buyer, right? And there's a tension between those two. And there's some cultural differences that are very important to understand as you build enterprise software. So it's not enough just to build it for the user. You need to take the buying center into account as well. At the same time, you can't just focus on the buying center and ignore the user. So the first metaphor I'm going to share with you is what I call the sunflower and the daisy metaphor, right? So if you think about an organization, they will have there are really two main sorts of organizations. There are organizations that have a strong central IT function, and there are organizations that have a strong line of business function. And in the organizations that have a strong IT function, there's a tendency to go for one core vendor, right? So for instance, an SAP or a Workday or an Oracle or whatever, and then be very reluctant to put other solutions in that organization. They will put solutions, but they will be around the edges, right? And usually selling solutions into those kind of organizations is quite difficult, and designing solutions for those organizations is quite difficult, right? They tend to focus on, they have an answer, for instance, like SAP first or Oracle first or whatever, and it's quite hard to move in, right? So think about those organizations having a large core and small edges. Like a sunflower, you have a big core of the sunflower and petals at the edges. And so selling into those organizations generally takes longer. On the upside, once you're in for a long time, right? The other type of organization is what I call the daisy, right? And they tend to have a small focus on the central systems, and then they spend more money and effort on innovative systems around the edges, right? Typically, you'll find these organizations, for instance, in HR, they will maybe buy SAP or SuccessFactors or Workday for their core processes, but then they will buy something else for recruitment, they will buy something else for learning, they'll buy something else for performance management. Similarly, you'll find that in financials, they will buy a general ledger, a core general ledger from one vendor, and then they will buy specialist best of breed applications for multiple from multiple edge vendors. And so one of the things to understand when you bring a product to market is who you're selling to. Are you selling it to customers that are you building it for customers that have this strong focus on the core system, or are you building it for customers that have more of an innovation around the edges mentality, right? And companies can change over time, but this will really determine a lot of the time is who you talk to. Are you selling and building products together with the IT department of your customer, or are you spending more time working with the line of business? And over time you see these trends changing. At the moment, we're in a big wave of DAISY. We see a lot of organizations now driving to edge, exploring edge applications with the cloud, and the cloud makes this model easier. And I'll come to some of the reasons why that is at the moment. But as a product manager, when I go into an organization, I understand within a couple of minutes, am I dealing with a sunflower or am I dealing with a daisy? And that will really change how you think about that organization. There are two anti-patterns. I'm not going to talk about them in detail today. The first one of those is a cactus, right? A cactus is an organization that only buys stuff from one vendor, right? And they have a really, really sort of bigoted approach of thinking about just from that one vendor. They say, we have a Oracle strategy or we have an SAP strategy, and they rarely entertain third-party applications, right? That's an anti-pattern because those organizations tend not to innovate. The other anti-pattern is what I call a dandelion, right? Which is that fluffy little flower that when you blow at it, the petals just fly away. And those are organizations that are always piloting everything, right? You know the ones, right? They invite you in, they love your product, they say, oh, let's do a pilot. And you do a proof of concept with them. And it was really easy. You got the proof of concept in 2 or 3 days. They agreed to do a proof of concept. You start off and you find yourself doing proof of concepts forever, right? And after a little while, you're less fashionable, so they do a proof of concept with something else. And as a startup, that's probably the most dangerous anti-pattern organization, because you think you won the business, but actually they're just messing you around. And beware of those. Beware of those. Okay, so talking about customers for a second, one of the most important things for you to do in enterprise software is to understand who your ideal customer is, right? So your ideal customer is somebody that there's two things, right? The ideal customer in terms of the organization and ideal customer in terms of user, right? And your ideal customer in terms of organization, you kind of need to figure that out, what's your product market fit and so on. But finding 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 actual physical human beings that you can talk to, that you can engage with about your product is fundamentally very, very, very important, right? Those are the people that are betting their careers on your product. Those are the people to whom you turn to validate your research. One of the things that's changed dramatically in product management over the last couple of years has been the amount and the ease of which you can get data to help make product decisions. This is one of the benefits of cloud computing, is that you're able to analyze your users much more effectively than you ever could in on-premise software. And the tools and the sophistication in terms of software to help you do that today is really, really very, very impressive. So product management today is much more analytical than it was a few years ago, but it's still very important to know who your users are, and to be really find those users that are committed to your success, and for those users to work very closely with those users. I always used to say to people in my team that I want every product manager to know at least for 3 customers to know the names of their kids, right? So if you know people in your customer base well enough that you're talking about the families and you know them, you know that person. And those are the people you can ask really deep questions about your product. I'm going to speed this on a bit. The second metaphor I'd like to give you is one about feature versus function. And I'd like you to imagine it's 1927 and you want to travel from Hamburg to New York, right? And you would get a brochure in those days, and it would describe to you all about the ship, right? It would tell you about what orchestra was playing. It would tell you how big the dance floor was, where there was a tennis court, how many chefs there were on the boat, how big the room was, and it would be all about the features of the ship, right? Because the ship was, if you like, the dominant design. So, you know, you were talking always about the features on the ship, right? Then there was these other weird guys down the road, you know, who would tell you, okay, well, you get into our device and the seats are really, really comfortable. It's very, very noisy, right? We're only going to give you a sandwich, right? And, you know, we're still figuring this out, so it might even crash, right? It's called an airplane, right? And if you compare those two things on features, you would never get in an airplane, right? But what happened is, over time, airplanes become so much more effective at the function of flying that they overcame the great feature list of the ship, right? And this is a problem, I think, with many software companies is incumbent software companies tend to be like ships, right? They tend to think a lot about building more and more and more and more features, right? And when you're in early stage of a software company, you really need to think about being like that early stage of the airplane. And, you know, I know the terminal viable product is very, very popular, but as you're building something new and something perhaps disruptive, you really need to focus on what are those fundamental features that make this thing different, right? Because you will never compete with the big vendors in terms of number of features, right? You have to do something a little bit different. Same when you're building internal products as well. Work out what those things are that are different. And don't always assume because something worked in the past, it's going to work in the future. So again, if you're drawing the list of features for a new product, right, taking the airplane metaphor to its nth degree, if you ask a designer of a ship about a transport mechanism, they'll say it will need a swimming pool. And we all know that swimming pools and airplanes don't go well together. So be always prepared to challenge historical assumptions about what needs to be in a product, especially if you're doing something fundamentally disruptive. Right? I took this photo this morning before I came to Paris. Actually, my wife took it, in fairness. It's on the Philosophienweg, just above Heidelberg. And it's the wall there. And it's a very famous wall. It was, you know, laid out by the Romans, I think. But what struck me is the action that happens between the stones. And products are a bit like this. The opportunity in software is often in the gaps between software. And what I mean by this is that there may be a big software vendor, there may be a small software vendor, and a medium-sized software vendor. They've all built these products, right? And if you're looking to launch something new, there is often gaps between those products that are very, very lucrative and very, very exciting, right? And let me give you one example of one that I've been working on recently. I've been working on something called employee communication software, right? Now, if you told me a few years ago that there was a $1 billion opportunity to build a $1 billion software company that helped with employee communications, I would challenge that. I would have challenged that because I said, well, you've got SharePoint, you know, and you've got the employee portals of the HR vendors. Why on earth would anyone need communication software? And you've got marketing software, that does stuff. Why does this niche exist? And what happened is vendors built better products in that gap, right? And that gap's grown and grown and grown and grown until they built really, really successful products that outperform the original suite vendors. So there is always opportunity to build products successfully in the niche, because the large vendors don't have time to fill every niche, right? And so even if an SAP or a Workday, an Oracle, or whoever it is, you know, say that they have everything, a lot of the time in particular areas, those products are actually quite weak. And if you're good at it, you can get to a point where you take over a much bigger portion of the market than you originally than you originally intended to do. So we see that time and time again in technology at the moment, that new vendors are able to come in and take a much bigger slice, and that's because, they've had that better focus on usability. They have better information about their customers. They're using more modern technology stacks. They understand the specific business problem better. So my advice to you here, just to sort of, as I move towards the end of this little session, is don't assume that the enterprise vendors own the market, right? As a product manager, there are many, many opportunities to build great solutions in gaps between these products. And the ability to raise money today, I spend quite a lot of time working with VCs, that if you have a good idea and you're starting to get traction, you can go out and raise 10, 20 million euros today and really own a niche, right? And so small niches can be extremely profitable for startups and even to scale-ups. An example recently is in the area of employee surveys, or what's called employee listening. A company called Peakon started about 5 or 6 years ago and grew to a point where they were acquired for 700 million by Workday. So there's a great opportunity in these small gaps, what seem like small gaps between big vendors. And if I advise to anybody that's doing a startup, that's where you start. You start in a niche, and then you grow from there. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about integration as a sort of semi-final metaphor for you today. If you speak to an enterprise customer, whether they're a sunflower or a daisy, and you do your pitch, right? The first question that IT is going to ask you is, how does this integrate? Right, and that's the first thing that IT asks you is about integration, right? And the first question, my response to that normally is, yes, of course we need integration. But when someone asks me for integration, it's a bit like they're asking me for weather, right? You can say, yes, we need weather today. Now, that is an accurate but particularly useless statement, right? When it comes to integration, you need to define precisely what integration is required. And in the process of doing this, and I'll come to the reason why there's a dog's photo here, you really need to understand why you're doing the integration, right? And the first part of understanding when you figure out the why and how of that integration is what system is in charge, right? Now, I'm not a vet, but I would imagine that if there was a dog and the tail was to fall off the dog, you could go to the vet, and stretching a metaphor here, and the vet could stitch the tail back on the dog, and the dog would be happy. It would be sore for a few weeks, but eventually the dog would be okay, right? So when you have two systems and you know which is the dog, which is the main system, and which is the subordinate system, integration is doable. The problem comes when you try and stitch two dogs together, right? That is not an easy experience, right? And that's my point about integration, is that you need to really think about why you're connecting two systems together, right? And always know which system is in charge, right? What is the lead system, and what is the subordinate system? And you need to do it right at a field level. And if in designing how you integrate, if you're designing how you put systems together, you know which fields are owned by which system, and which is the main source of truth for a particular data item, you will design very effective systems, and you will have very powerful integration, and you'll be able to connect to multiple vendors, and you'll be very successful. If you don't understand that, your integration will be the thing that will make your market success and problematic, and it will be the thing that will soak up your engineering capacity in ways that you cannot imagine, right? So always be careful of when people say we need to buy integration, we need integration. You need to keep asking why, right? And only build integration that you need, right? And when you build it, make sure that you build it knowing what the systems are that describe it. My last, very, very last metaphor for you, and then I'm going to stop talking, is the kangaroo. Right? And why on earth do I think that the kangaroo is a useful metaphor for product managers? This relates to a car company called Volvo, who you may all know, the Swedish now Chinese car company. About 6 or 7 years ago, they were working on driverless or augmented driving vehicles in Sweden and Finland, and they were testing them, and they were doing a really good job dealing with snow and ice and reindeer and elk and all the things that happen in those countries, and they could handle different types of snow and different types of ice and all the rest of it. And they were doing really, really well with the simulated driving thing. Then some genius in product marketing signed them up to a pilot project in Australia. And they thought, oh, okay. And so they took their products to Australia, and they found that they could cope with Australian conditions. So they could cope with very hot roads and melting tarmac and mirages from the heat, and they could cope with the long trucks that they had to overtake in Australia. They could cope with being on the other side of the road. But what completely destroyed the project was the kangaroo, because all the other animals they dealt with went in one direction, right? They didn't go up and down. And because the kangaroo goes up and down, it completely confused all the senses, right? And this essentially destroyed the pilot project for several years while they figured out how to reconfigure the sensors to cope with kangaroos. And the reason why I give you this story is that as a product manager, you will always think you've got all the requirements. You will think you know everything when you start building something. But when you hit the reality of customers, when you hit the reality of projects, often there will be a kangaroo that will jump out at you. And be ready for the kangaroos. You have no idea when they're going to come. And maybe you'll have a project where you have no kangaroos, but more than likely or not, almost every product management exercise involves some form of kangaroos. Yeah, right. So I wanted to finish off, give you a whole lot of reading that you can, you guys will get the slides, I'm sure. And then, some of the stuff I've been reading at the moment, there's when I started in product management, there was very little to read about software product management. Now there's a lot more stuff coming out there. Marty Kagan stuff is excellent. The book that I'd probably advise that everyone reads in enterprise software is Escaping the Build Trap, Melissa Perry. It's really, really excellent. And she has a new book out as well. So that's excellent stuff. And I mentioned a couple of blogs there. Dave Kellogg and I, he's probably the best product marketer in the world. We do a Clubhouse show every week where we talk about product. Love to have you guys come along and listen. But there are a lot of great product management, and there's lots you can learn today that really a few years ago wasn't available. I've talked probably slightly longer than I was planning to talk, but I'm going to stop here and take some questions. I see some familiar faces in the audience, which is lovely. Perry, nice to see you. Give me a wave just to know that you're listening. We used to work together back in the day. Yeah.
Thanks
cool.
a lot.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. That's kind of the high level messages that I wanted to give you. But perhaps if I leave you with one thing, is that kangaroo. They are deadly, kangaroos. All right. So maybe let me open up for questions and take it from there. So Elena, how would you like to take the questions, if there are any indeed?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Thomas. It was a really great talk and some really nice metaphors. I think they will stick for quite a long time in my mind, at least. So yeah, we can take questions. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself, and we are a fairly small audience, so let's keep it more interactive. So you can ask your question. You don't have to type it, but just feel free to ask one by one. So maybe if you want to start, just if someone is speaking, just keep your microphone on mute. Yeah, we have next few minutes to talk about any questions if someone has.
Hi guys, hi Thomas, this is Julian.
Hi Julian, nice to see you.
Hey, great talk, thanks a lot Thomas. One question that I had was, we spend a lot of time in product trying to avoid the kangaroos. And sometimes we build a lot of product complexity to try to avoid the kangaroo.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, you end up with a product that is super highly configurable, but people end up using one configuration only, and you've never hit the kangaroo.
Yeah.
So how do you have any how to avoid that and how to streamline business requirements that, okay, you'll never be able to avoid every kangaroo, but at least you have a product that fits 95%, 90% of the cases.
Yeah. The way I suggest you do that is you define who your ideal customer is, right? And you need to describe that ideal customer perfectly. And if you believe your ideal customer is Siemens, right, then you're going to have a lot of configuration, right? But if you believe your ideal customer is, I don't know, Flixbus, right, or Celonis, or LeanIX, or some mid-sized company, then your product scope is significantly smaller and simpler, and agility, etc., become more important product requirements. The problem comes is if you don't really know who that ideal customer is. So basically, you're not only building to avoid kangaroos, you're also building to avoid sharks, right? Right. So you end up, building to avoid or to cover everything. And I always say, like, you'd be amazed how big the market is if you're just really focused, right? And especially when you're smaller, right? Especially when you're smaller, right? Be sure about what business you want to win, right? Right. And the thing that I've advised a lot of companies to do, and I wish I'd done more of this when I had a real job, was something called a negative roadmap, right? And what I would do, I'm going to really urge, I always want my clients to do this, is you write down a negative roadmap, and that's when you write down the things clearly that you're not going to do. And you do it in a timeline as the way you would do a positive roadmap, right? So let's say, for instance, your Mandarin, okay? Let's say, like, you make a strategic decision, you're not doing Mandarin in Q1, Q2, right? So you write this down, it's on the negative roadmap. Yeah. What you know is going to happen is the first week in February, some sales guys are going to come knocking on the door and say, we've got an awesome deal opportunity in China, right? But we need Mandarin. And then you can say no, because we agreed as a executive team that we weren't doing Mandarin in Q1 or Q2. We agreed that. Right? If as a team we then decide to change that, then we have to say what comes off the positive roadmap and goes onto the negative roadmap, right? Because you've got finite capacity, right? And what happens is those things that come in like that, they're the things that complicate your product. It's the things that you didn't design. The things that you design tend to be the right things most of the time in product management. The things that come in as random, we need it for this deal, those are the things that mess up your product, right? Now, it sounds arrogant, but that's normally the case. So, follow a negative roadmap. Do the other thing, which I really like at the moment, the new theory of hypothesis-based product management, right? If you don't know what that is, it's quite simple. It sounds simple, but it's hard. Is, test-driven development in engineering, where you write the test first, right? And then you build the code, and then once the code passes all the tests, then you've built the code, right? That's a very good practice in engineering. Hard to do, but a good practice. In product, what we should do is, what's the hypothesis of success, right? So your hypothesis of success might be, 70% adoption rate of a particular feature. It might be for instance, it might be we shortened the average time of recruit from 3 weeks to 2 weeks. It might be that we improve payroll accuracy by 0.7%, whatever that thing is you're trying to achieve, right? And then you work out how to measure that achievement, right? And the advantage of saying, okay, we don't build anything until we know how to measure its success, is that very quickly you kill off the random suggestions, because the random suggestions are we need this to win this deal. And that's not enough to base the hypothesis on. The other thing I'd strongly suggest you do in that as well is, if you make a promise in 2019 to build something, and you build that for customer A, go back in 2020 and see if they're using it. 9 times out of 10, they aren't. So the things that you were forced to promise in the sales cycle aren't even used in things. So you destroyed your roadmap to build this thing to win this deal, and then even though you won the deal, they still didn't use that thing, right? And document those. And so that then when the next one comes along, you can say, hang on a minute, we're not going to do this because the last three things we built that you've suggested, or you've insisted, no one's actually used. But as product managers today, you have the data, right? So it's much easier today to push back than it was, say, 5 years ago on those kind of requirements. But every now and again, you're going to get a kangaroo. You're going to get something that comes out of the blue, and you just have to take it. But I think if you can do that hypothesis-based and the negative roadmap, you get on top of that and know who your ideal customer is.